Hey guys, welcome to Narrow Door Church. My name is Joey Fitzpatrick. My wife Allison and I are good friends of Sean and Andrea, and so we've been with Narrow Door Church since its beginning, at the beginning of the year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Bible to Psalm 1. I hope you guys do the same. I'm just going to read the first half of it for you all. Book 1, The Way of the Righteous and the Wicked. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. It doesn't say that we bear fruit in every season. No, instead it says there's a designated time where we are called to bear fruit. For some of us, this feels like a spiritual winter, right? Where there's the question of, okay, God, like, what's next? What's happening in the world? And it's been an anxious time for a lot of us. We truly do feel the brokenness and the weight of sin just all around us, right? Like, this is not fun. Even when this season of life that we find ourselves in might be having us asking like big questions like, hey, am I going to be okay? Are things going to work out? We have to remember the truths that God calls us to meditate on. And the truth is that he's going to provide. When I think about just the season of life that we're in, COVID, the pandemic, whatever it may be, there's a lot of other things that I'm sure we're all facing. Let's remember to, as the psalm illustrates, be blessed by remembering God's provision. Be blessed by remembering his promises. He provided his son. And so let's just, it just makes me excited to see how are we going to see that in today's message by Sean. So thanks for listening to that, guys. And then last thing before we get started is don't forget to comment below your household attendance. No matter what, just let us know. That'd be super great. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Narrow Door Church. My name is Sean Emery, and we are in the middle of our teaching on the Scarlet Thread, which is where we discover the gospel and Jesus in the entire Bible, including the Old Testament. So last Sunday, we're kind of launching from last Sunday so that we're kind of segueing into it as we go. But we talked about the blood covenant 2 Sundays ago, and then last Sunday we actually applied that knowledge. And so understanding the process of the blood covenant gave us deeper context to not only read, but study the Bible in Genesis 15. And there's a big difference that we pointed out between reading and studying. And so now, throughout the entire Bible, when it speaks of sacrifices and it references the covenant between God and man, we have that deeper understanding which helps us see more into what's really going on. Today, we're going to learn another concept which will give us a deeper context when we read the Bible. We're going to go through some popular stories and characters, assuming that you are familiar with them. So I'm not going to read through the entire story. That would take a long time. And that's something you can actually do on your own, and it's a lot of fun. So if you haven't before, read Joseph's story at the beginning of Genesis 37. It's pretty tense, and I'm going to cover some highlights. So spoiler alert, but it's been 2,000 years, so you've had plenty of time. We'll also be going through the highlights of Moses. You can check out the animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, although I thought the book was much better. And you might think it's funny that I'm doing a spoiler alert for a literal ancient book. But you'd be surprised at how many people's Bible knowledge comes from BuzzFeed articles. So that's why I'm doing it. The title of today's teaching is Consecrated. Consecrated. So we're going to be in Genesis 15. That's where we've been for a while. And we're going to look at 2 verses that are going to catapult us forward. So Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out of it with great possessions. So this is in Genesis chapter 15, in the middle of where God makes a blood covenant for Abraham. He makes the covenant with himself, but he makes it for Abraham. So as the lineage of Abraham continues, we get to the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph is persecuted and betrayed by everyone, including his own family. Joseph, however, isn't swayed towards revenge or punishment. He doesn't act like everyone else around him, and he doesn't do what everyone thinks he will do. Joseph is an example of your old-fashioned plot twist. Joseph is a prime example of vigilance in holiness. He was set apart, and he strived for that. God uses Joseph to redeem all of the evil done to him. So all this evil, all this injustice that was done to Joseph repeatedly, God used all of that to redeem it. And thus, Joseph ends up being in a place of power and prominence in Egypt. Now, the book of Exodus, we get to the end of the book of Genesis. The book of Exodus starts with a new Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph, but he realizes that there's an entire people group that have assimilated into Egyptian culture, and they might pose a threat, which brings us to the birth of Moses. I told you I was going to go through this. It's going to be a lot today. It's going to be like fire hose, so have your Bible ready. This brings us to the birth of Moses, and a quick note on Moses, specifically his name. His name is actually Egyptian. It's actually an Egyptian name, not a Hebrew name. And it's the Egyptian word for born, or it could be used as son. Coincidentally, it sounds like a Hebrew word. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but Moshe, it sounds similar to the Hebrew word for being drawn out of, to draw out of. And so Pharaoh's daughter in the story finds Moses, and she draws him out of the water. He's in a basket in the Nile. She draws him out of the water, and so she actually says that she names him Moses after this Egyptian word based on that she drew this boy out of the water. Just an interesting note that we'll come back to in a little bit. So Moses carries on this theme of holiness and consecration. And through the evil acted out against him, the injustice acted out against him, God redeems it to bring Moses to a place of prominence and power. Moses is cut out of the royal family of Pharaoh, and he becomes the leader of the Hebrew people. So if you know the story of Moses, he grows up in Pharaoh's court. He is very powerful. He's very, very educated. He's living amongst the wealthy. And then later he transitions to being a leader of the Hebrew people. And so this brings us to this next phase of the story. God inflicts 10 plagues on Egypt, which, if you're familiar, the 10 plagues, and these plagues are part of this consecration. So keep saying this word, consecration. And this is where we're really going to get into that. So in the same way that God redeems evil to conclude in mercy, in the same way that God redeemed the evil and the injustice against Joseph, the evil and the injustice against Moses, God redeems it to conclude in mercy. But it also works in the other direction. It's a two-way street. Because with God, even blessings can become acts of justice. So even the good things that happen can end up becoming the justice that's meted out for evil acts. And so Egyptian religion, back then in ancient times, you had, it was a little bit pantheistic, so they had multiple gods and deities, and then each was sort of tasked with certain roles and titles. And the whole idea of Egyptian religious life was you had this concept called ma'at. And for lack of a better term, it was the harmony between the individual and everything else. So it was harmony of people, harmony between mankind and God, between nature and God and man. It was basically just constant balance. And so it was Pharaoh's job to mediate that. It was Pharaoh's job to mediate Ma'at. And so in a way, Pharaoh was a sort of avatar of the gods. He was a representative. But they looked, he would have been considered divine, powerful, supernatural, person. So, all that to say, the Nile River, which is where Egypt sat, the Nile River was the catalyst for Egypt's vast agricultural wealth. So you have this situation where this new Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, and he sees that the Hebrew people have assimilated into the culture. He sees that they might pose a threat. And so what does he do? He sends out this decree. All male firstborns of the Hebrew people are to be thrown into the Nile River. And the Nile River, which is sort of the reason that Egypt has become has blossomed into this world superpower at the time, just as Pharaoh had commanded all the firstborns to be thrown into it, God's first plague of the 10, simply mirrored back to Egypt their own evil. This thing that was a blessing suddenly became a curse. In Exodus 7, verses 20 and 21, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. This begins God's work of disharmony, and Pharaoh's struggle to mediate it. Interestingly, in the story you have, Pharaoh calls his sorcerers and the magicians. He calls them in, and they can never undo the harm caused. They can only replicate it. And that's because evil begets evil. Only God can redeem it. In Exodus 11, God tells Moses that the final plague and withdrawal from Egypt. So it comes to the end. All these terrors have been unleashed on Egypt and the Egyptian people. Pharaoh is not budging. He is struggling to maintain balance. And so in Exodus 11, verses 6 and 7, God tells Moses about, okay, we've reached the end game, and here's what you need to do. Verse 6, there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So let's go back to this note about Moses' name. It meant son drawn out of water. The same river decreed for killing infants by Pharaoh was the same place that Moses was saved. God had made a distinction between Moses and everyone else. He was set apart. He was consecrated. Egypt, the same land that God told Abraham in Genesis 15 would afflict his people, is the same place God would draw them out of. It's the same place that harm would be done to Abraham's descendants is the same place that God would rescue them out of, just like the river. So God was making a distinction between the people he made a covenant with and everyone else. They were cut out of the whole. They were consecrated. Exodus 12 details the memorial of this event. And if you're familiar, a couple weeks ago we talked about the memorial. Last Sunday we even went into it, the memorial. So that when you make a covenant, that it's not just this one-time thing, but it is this epic event. And you would do a memorial to that event so that everyone would remember it, that they could look at that and remember it for generations. And so in Exodus 12, we're going to go through the verses. We're going to point out some different details because this is sort of the instructions that God is giving to Moses, and then Moses gives to all the elders of the Hebrew people. And it's very important. It's very, very important, and God is very, very specific. And so I want to point out a few things. Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 1, and we're going to read down just a few verses, and it might skip around a little bit. Chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Verses 1 and 2, God is essentially saying, you are no longer part of this world. You are no longer part of the world operating by their rules, their schedules. You are being drawn out of it, consecrated to me. Your old timeline has literally ended. You are starting a brand new one. Month 1, day 1. So, verse 3. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. So in verses 3 through 6, God had made a blood covenant with these people, and there's an opportunity to remain in it or dismiss yourself from it. So if you're interested in continuing to be in this covenant, this is essentially what God is, he's kind of laying this out. If you're interested in continuing to be in this covenant, each household is to get a lamb on the 10th day of the month, and for 5 days, inspect it for blemishes and faults. So you have 5 days, check it, make sure there's nothing wrong, that it is that it's worthy worthy of sacrifice to me. And on the 14th day, the lamb is to be sacrificed. Everyone's going to do this at the same time, and this is a unified process. Let's go back to verse 7, and let's read a few more. Verse 7, then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it, its head with its legs and its inner parts, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So, a few details here. God says that you're to sacrifice the lamb on the threshold, and so you would take some of the blood and you would sprinkle it on the lintel and the posts. And so the 2 Hebrew words here that I want to point out are mezuzah, which would have meant the vertical posts, and then the lintel, which would have been the crossbeam, and that Hebrew word is mashkof. And so this will be important as we continue on, but essentially what God is saying is that every house would have had this threshold, this door, okay, comprised of these 2 posts and 2 crossbeams, and you were to sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on that threshold. And then you were to cook the lamb completely and eat the sacrifice. These are very specific instructions, and when you read it, you have to wonder, you have to be curious. Why is it so specific? Why do you have to do these things in such a specific way? Well, it's constantly in contrast to everyone else. So for instance, in ancient times, in other religions, it was pretty common practice to eat the sacrifices raw. So it was pretty bloody, it was gruesome. God, he's saying, cook it completely. Cook it completely, don't leave any leftovers. And it's just another detail on how they are being consecrated, that they're being drawn out from the culture, from the world, from similar things, that they're special, they are different. And then he says, get fully dressed and ready, as if you are about to depart on a trip. Tension is building. Let's read verses 12 and 13. 12 and 13, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. These two verses are huge because this is where we see the reason. That's where we see the why about all these specific instructions and these details. It's where we see God's sort of the conclusion to these plagues and all these terrible events that have transpired. The blood was innocence that would cover the household from sin. It would cover the household from sin. And we've talked about that before. The only covering for sin, for guilt, is innocence. That's the only thing that will work. And so God, He is telling them, hey, if you want to continue to be in this blood covenant with me, I'm going to execute judgment, justice on this entire place. There's been numerous acts of evil and injustice done man against man, and it's time for some balance. And so God's saying, if you want to be in this blood covenant with me, if you want to be rescued from that, then you need to cover your guilt. You need to cover your sin with innocence, and this is how. And so the blood was a sign. It was innocence that would cover the household from their sin. They would be passed over in judgment, which is where we get the name Passover. It's where that comes from. So just like the first plague of the Nile turning into blood, just like the first plague was a reflection of Egypt's blessing now becoming their curse, the final plague was the same. The final plague was the same. Egypt was vast, and they had tried to enforce their lineage. Pharaoh, had tried to enforce Egyptian lineage by killing all of the Hebrew firstborns, by throwing them into the river. And God was now taking all of the firstborn Egyptians that had been saved or spared in that original decree by Pharaoh, and He was exacting justice. And in an ironic twist, God was actually restoring the balance, or ma'at, which was actually Pharaoh's job. Really cool little, it's kind of like a mic drop. I love that. Let's skip ahead in chapter 12. I want to point out just two more verses. Chapter 12, I want you to skip down to verses 40 through 42. So that's like 3 scrolls if you're on an iPad or a tablet. So verses 40 through 42. The time of the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. These verses are a callback. They're a callback to what God told Abraham back in Genesis 15, 400 years of affliction. So, after hundreds of years and many generations, God gave mankind another reminder or a memorial. The covenant was still on. The covenant was still on. The scarlet thread, the salvation from sin, was still being woven and redeemed out of the darkest circumstances, the greatest atrocities, and the narrowest path. That was what was going on. You have this whole story, this whole period of time where the Hebrew people, they assimilate into this other culture. They're supposed to be journeying towards the promised land, the covenantal, rights. But they stop, they get comfortable, they get hung up in Egypt. That leads to them sort of assimilating with this culture. And what had to happen in order for God's covenant to continue, in order for it to keep To get there, Israel had to be consecrated back to God. They had to be given back to God. We've talked about holiness in some of our earliest sermons. Holiness is this concept of, it means cut out from the whole. So it's this idea of being unique, this idea of being completely different in contrast to everything else. God is perfectly holy. He cannot be compared with anything else. There's nothing even remotely like God. And so that's the definition of holiness. And holiness is part of our end game. As a Christian, we are striving towards holiness. We are striving to look less like the world and more like Jesus. And so let's take that framework. Let's look back at the story of Moses in Egypt. The Israelites had been jammed into a system and a culture in which they did not belong. They had become part of a whole. So despite all the ma'at, or the harmony in the world, here's the reality. Sin only metastasizes and multiplies. That's the reality of sin. In Egypt, Pharaoh had called the sorcerers and the magicians, these were the representatives of supernatural power, the representatives of the deities. And they actually had a term for this, that everything was magical or mystical, and that term was Heka. And so these were the wielders of this magic, or Heka, this supernatural power. And even they could only replicate more destruction. They couldn't undo it. They couldn't redeem it. Only God can redeem it for good. And so you have this situation where Egypt is Egypt is not of God. The Israelites, the Hebrew people, they have assimilated in. They have been sidetracked from the covenant. And so Moses, you have this character who rises out. Moses, he is cut out from the whole, a son drawn out of water. Moses is this symbol of a sojourner. He even names his son after that idea. And his own identity, Moses' own identity, was unclear and uncertain. Is he Egyptian? Is he Hebrew? What is his role in all of this? You know, he struggles, and his identity, it's blurry. And it was the same with Israel. It was the same with Israel and the Hebrew people. Their identity had become blurry with other cultures and practices. And they had forgotten the covenant that God had made. It was no longer top priority. It was no longer the forefront of everything they did. And you might say, well, they still kept some of their traditions. Well, they did. But they were also serving the Egyptian culture. They were also doing things the Egyptian way. And so God has consecrated people to be set apart from the world. And there are many people today who are like the Egyptians. There's two sides of this coin. There's many people today who are like the Egyptians. They're satisfied with their land, their fame, their opportunities, their accomplishments. But there are always those living among them who never quite feel at home. They need to remember that their identity is not of this world, but that they can be Moses, that they can be a son drawn out of it. So the question, the way that we take all this information, that we put it together, and the thing that you need to ask yourself and consider in light of all this, in light of this story, is, are you spending time on being holy? This word consecrated, to be set apart, to be given to God, well, that is a process. That's an actual action. It's not just something you think about. It's something that happens to you. It's something that you do. How much time are you spending on that? Have you spent any time on it? Do you strategize how to do it better and more effectively? Do you meet with others to support each other as a team effort? Is holiness, is being consecrated, this having your identity in Jesus, not of the culture. Is that one of your top priorities? And I say one of your top priorities. If you're a Christian, it is your top priority. The reality and the simple way that we make sense of this, and the simple thing, I don't want to guilt trip you. I don't want to say that, you gotta be hardcore and like stop doing all this stuff. That's not what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying. But it is very, very important that you're diligent about it. So you see me every week, and I have had so many people, including my own family, tell me that you're super giddy. Andrew tells me to stop standing on my toes all the time because I get so excited, and it's like it's hard to contain because I have so much adrenaline, and I'm like pumped, And it's like this pretty much the entire time that I'm reading and studying the Bible. I just constantly am like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this. I have to share it. And here's the thing. Why am I like that? It's not my personality. It's not who I am. It's how amazing the Bible is. It's how good God is. It's what the Holy Spirit, it's the natural reaction of the Holy Spirit. Understand that. This is actually not how I walk around all the time. I don't go shopping and, hey everybody, I'm really, really glad to be here. No. My excitement, my adrenaline is a natural response to how epic and amazing the Holy Spirit is, how epic and amazing God is, how beautifully scientific and woven the Bible is. It's a natural response. If you're looking at me and you're telling yourself that this is just Sean and you're just you, and that no, maybe you aren't reading the Bible right. Maybe you're reading it, and what needs to happen is to study it. Maybe your priorities need a slight adjustment. And again, I'm not guilt tripping. I'm talking to myself. My priorities get out of line often. I've had 3 terrible days this week where I could not focus. I could not get into it. And I just had to pray and ask, God, help me get this. Help me see how amazing this is. And he did. Are you spending time being consecrated, being holy? Are you striving towards it? Are you diligent? Are you vigilant? Are you alert? Are you aware? Is it your top priority? Keep working, keep having fun, keep serving others, but don't find yourself getting comfortable. Don't catch yourself looking and living like everybody else. This is not our home. This is not our kingdom. Okay? You and I are sojourners in a strange land, and we are making our way home. I will see you next Sunday, where it will be even more exciting, I hope, as we look back at this passage with this knowledge and we go even deeper into the story. See you then.